Hello friends, welcome back to another Year in the Bible video. In this video I'm going to be going through Hebrews, James, and 1st and 2nd Peter. In the video that follows I'm going to finish the New Testament with the Johns and Jude and Revelation. And then my plan right now is to come back at the end of the year, maybe the last week of the year, with a final video in this series to kind of reflect on the entire process of reading the Bible in a year. So diving into Hebrews begins this kind of shift, whereas the previous, 13 letters have been from Paul or attributed to Paul, and we're now switching to the general epistles, sometimes called the Catholic epistles, although a lot of people for a long time thought that Paul wrote Hebrews. I think it's scholarly agreed upon now that he probably didn't, that we don't actually know who wrote Hebrews. And to me, that fits because you think about it. I've been reading, day by day, reading through entire letters from Paul. When you get to Hebrews, although the theology and some of the ideas seem very much in line with what Paul has been writing prior to this, the way that it reads, the actual language feels a lot different. It feels like someone else wrote this when you read it. And I looked this up, and many scholars say that in the Greek New Testament, Hebrews has the most sophisticated use of Greek language, that it's really someone who knew the language really well and was able to write and had a great gift for writing. And I kind of think that it translates that way in English. You can kind of sense that. But Hebrews as a whole, I'll say this, I've told you that I teach the Bible at Belmont University, and I told my students, if there's one thing I want you to remember about Hebrews, it's that it makes a really great name for a Christian coffee shop. Get it? Hebrews? Sorry, that's a terrible joke, and I know that there are some coffee shops out there called Hebrews, but what I did tell my students was the thing I want them to remember about Hebrews is, and it really reads off the page, again, I read this straight through in one sitting, the superiority of Jesus compared to everything else. The writer of Hebrews clearly knows the history of Israel and is writing to a Jewish audience, and he's kind of walking them through it. It kind of recaptures so many different key moments in their history, but each time it says, Jesus is better. Jesus surpasses this, whether it's the angels, whether it's Moses and the Torah, whether it's the high priests and Melchizedek. I kind of wrote in the margins as I highlighted things in my Bible. I wrote in the margins, okay, here he's talking about Jesus being superior to Moses, and here greater than the high priest. So it's kind of marching through. It really reads like a big long sermon more than it does a letter, right? It's marching straight through the entire history of the people of Israel and kind of constantly pointing to the fact that Jesus is better. And so therefore, follow Jesus. Stay faithful to Jesus because of all of this history that we have behind us. He is the epic conclusion of that story, the fulfillment of that story, the climax, if you will, of that story. So here's a great verse I just highlighted in chapter 7. Unlike the other high priests, he has no need to offer sacrifices day after day. So he's talking about what the priests do, right? First for his own sins, and then for those of the people. This he did once and for all when he offered himself. I love the comparison there between the high priest and Jesus. Then it goes on to talk about the covenant, and the covenant we have through Christ is the superior covenant. And then yes, we get to the chapters 11 and 12, which is probably the most famous chapters of Hebrews, where we talk about the history of the faith, and it's like the who's who, right? Starting with Abraham and Moses and going through all of these different epic heroes of the faith in the Israelite community, and saying these are a cloud of witnesses that look to Jesus, who all of their faith points to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith. I really love that. I just think it's so, Hebrews is it's a theological juggernaut. It's so well written. It's this beautiful sermon, and it's just like, hey, Jesus is better. Follow Jesus, stay focused on him, everything that's come before us. It really is a beautifully written and articulated kind of story about who Jesus is, and it's very unique to the rest of the books in the New Testament. James feels totally different than Hebrews, right? Probably written by James, the brother of Jesus. And whereas Hebrews is like this one long flowing sermon, James feels very choppy. It's like short little snippets, almost like I think of Proverbs in the Old Testament, where you get a couple verses here and there's like hundreds of different topics all jammed together. James feels like he's popping around to different things. I felt some allusions to the Sermon on the Mount and like the different things that are covered in there, but really interesting to read James, and once again, and I've kind of mentioned this a couple times in the letters of Paul, that so often Paul's digging deeply into the theology of who Jesus is and what he's done for us, but also reminding people that how they live matters. As I kind of said in the last couple of videos, not that works earns us our salvation. I don't believe that, but that works is the only right response to the reality of what Jesus has done for us. And so here you have in James, these famous things where he says, faith without deeds is dead. Like you have to be doers of the word, not just hearers of the word. So here we have someone else in these early line of apostles who said, you have to live this out. You have to live like you believe this. These things are often, they've been challenging to people who want to talk about grace and works as two separate things that don't go hand in hand. I mean, even Martin Luther famously had talked about how he would, if he had his way, that he would take James out of the New Testament, right? I've also read other places where Luther very much understood that the life of faith is a life of works in response to that faith, that saving grace of Jesus. But really interesting just to kind of think of James. It says, get to work. Like, really live this out. You've heard the truth. You know the truth. Now your life needs to bear the fruit of that. And that's what I think that it's really getting at here in James. And so there's some warnings in there. There's some encouragement in there. But it's also saying, hey, live this out. Live like you believe that this is true. And then 1st and 2nd Peter, kind of a shift again. These two letters, they're seeming to be, I guess 1st Peter feels like it's more focused on, like, we've talked about this again in some of Paul's letters, like one of the themes is the early followers of Jesus starting to feel persecution for their faith. And so he's addressing that a lot in 1 Peter, saying, hey, this is normal. You are going to be persecuted because you live in this Roman world, and what we're calling you to do, the way we're calling you to live in allegiance to Christ above anything else, is really important, and it's going to cause tension with the world around you. I feel like 1 Peter kind of sets this tone, which I sense is like the us versus the world, right? And we're in the world, but not of the world. Those kind of ideas, I really feel like that flows out of some of this language in 1 Peter. There's some very famous verses. Always be ready to make a defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. We hear that verse a lot, right? Always be ready to defend the hope that you have. The very next line, it's not even the end of a sentence, says, yet do it with gentleness and reverence. It's a reminder to me that sometimes I want to defend my faith and I want to be really firm with it, but we're told to do it with gentleness. We're told to do it with reverence for the people that we're disagreeing with, right? And above all, he says in chapter 4, verse 8, maintain constant love for one another, for love covers a multitude of sins. I noted that 1 Peter felt like it was like speaking to people who felt persecuted, trying to encourage them, but it was really like uplifting. You turn the page into 2 Peter. 2 Peter is a totally different tone. It feels much more harsh, much more direct and abrupt. He's talking about people who are teaching false things. Clearly, from the writings of Paul, from the writings of Peter, there was already early on in the history of the church, after the apostles started these communities, other people, other leaders would show up and start to teach things that were slightly different and that they disagreed with. And they were like, hey, you have to be careful who you let teach, who you let shepherd your communities, because you've got to be careful. Particularly here in 2 Peter, one of the other things, right, so they talked a lot about persecution and how do we deal with that, now the reality of that, and also the fact of, like, when is Jesus going to return? They clearly thought, and this has always been a point of I guess lack of clarity for me, is that they clearly thought Jesus was going to return sooner than he did or hasn't yet, right? And so he's addressing that, and this is where we get that language of, like, you don't know exactly when it's going to happen. But I love chapter 3, verses 8. Sometimes we talk about, we don't know the hour, that sort of thing. But chapter 3, verse 8 in 2 Peter says, do not ignore this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like 1 day. The Lord is not slow about his promise, as some think of slowness, but is patient with you. I don't really know why Jesus hasn't returned yet, but I know that God is not slow, that God is patient, that God is kind. And so this is a call to watch out for what we believe and to be ready, right? To live like we know that Jesus is returning, right? I think one of the things here, Hebrews, Jesus is better. James, live like you believe that. Peter, when you face persecution, when you face confusion and doubt, press in and trust that what you know about Jesus and the way that you're living for Jesus is what you should be doing. That should be the focus of your lives. It's really beautiful how those 4 books kind of work together in a really unique way. I'm not sure that I would have noticed that had I been reading them like 5 or 6 verses at a time, but the fact that I read these literally, I read Hebrews one day, James the next day, and First and Second Peter I read in one sitting. So 3 days getting all that. I'm able to kind of see the threads woven together a little bit more in these books. So yeah, that's the reflection on Hebrews, James, and First and Second Peter. I've now got probably just, I don't know if I'm going to be able to read Revelation in one sitting. I might try, but I've probably only got 2 or 3 days of reading left to finish the Bible. And I'm really excited about that. As I've shared in a previous video, my plan is to read the Apocrypha for the first time. I'm not going to make that part of this series. I'll probably release a video early next year and kind of share my reflections on that process. But this is really cool. I'm getting so much out of it. I really love it, and I really love all of you and the encouragement that you're giving me, and the fact that you've been watching these videos, and lately a lot of you have really been encouraging to me about the fact that this feels more like I'm kind of teaching the Bible a little bit as I go, and I really do have a passion for God's Word and for teaching it, and I've spent some time in both church ministry and college ministry teaching the Bible, and I really love it, and so maybe I will kind of explore some ways to do that more on my channel in the future. But anyway, next up, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation. That video should be coming out in about a week. I know it's the holiday season. I'm right here kind of finishing up this giveaway thing that I have going on, so check out my channel if you want to enter to win some Bibles. And my prayer is that you would have a great Christmas season with your loved ones, and that this would just be a meaningful time for you. So thank you so much for watching. As always, thank you for the encouragement. I'll see you next time.